and I'd like to warmly welcome you to this fourth in our public seminar series, which began a few months ago. We had the first of these on the new geopolitics of energy. We had a second one featuring the Attorney General on community resilience and national security. We had a third posing the question whether transnational organised crime is or is not a national security issue. And this evening we're looking at some suggested priorities for the national security agenda of the incoming government. The aim of these seminars is really in a public forum, both for those attending and for those who are listening on vodcast, to bring together some presenters of experience and expertise, but often different vantage points, to present some of their thinking on topical issues of relevance to policymakers and to the community generally in Australia on national security issues. As a result, we're not looking for, nor will there be, unanimity of views. We're looking for insights and judgments based on fact and experience. This evening we have very fortunate to have three eminently qualified presenters who will each present their point of view, and then the forum will be open for discussion. This issue that we're addressing, of course, suggested priorities in national security policy making, will inevitably elicit quite a range of views, I'm sure, from our presenters this evening. And that's a natural phenomenon based partly on the fact that people take different views on what this concept of national security actually is. It's also inevitable because people apply different criteria to national security policy making requirements. People have different interpretations of our interests and our values, the nature of power in the 21st century, the balance between traditional state-centric national security issues and non-traditional transnational issues which some describe as human security issues. All of these factors will weigh in the different deliberations that people bring to this. But one thing I'm sure of this evening is that we do have three presenters who will bring real insight and judgment and experience to these issues. I'd like to introduce the first of these this evening, Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb, whom I'm sure everybody in this room will either know or be aware of. Paul is currently, as well as being an Emeritus Professor, Chairman of the Advisory Board of the School of International Political and Strategic Studies. Before that, his background, of course, which many of you will know, includes leadership of the Strategic Defence and Defence Studies Centre here at the ANU for 12 years, up to 2003. Before that, a Deputy Secretary in the Department of Defence. Before that, Director of the Joint Intelligence Organisation. Before that, back in the 1970s, Head of the National Assessment Staff of the National Intelligence Committee. And I'm really delighted that Paul's here this evening for many reasons, both personal and professional. But I'm particularly delighted because he's someone that over many years has established a genuine international reputation for his scholarship on strategic studies. But more than that, he's one of the few people, very few people, who can genuinely lay claim to having directly helped shape defence policy as well as analyse it in an intellectual way. So I'm delighted, Paul, that you've come, and look forward very much to your comments.
Thank you, Michael, and might I say how delighted I am after your stellar career as Cabinet Secretary and High Commissioner in London and Secretary of Foreign Affairs that you've joined the ANU, as you and I discussed on many occasions, and it's great to have you at this university. The theme of what I'm going to say will be somewhat critical of some policy priorities for defence, but unlike some commentators recently, I will not be arguing that the Defence White Paper needs wholesale rewriting, not wholesale rewriting, and I will not be arguing that our strategic future is imminently threatening in a major way. although there are some longer-term issues on the horizon that are of concern. I want to address four main topics. First, money and the defence budget, remembering that defence spends $27 billion a year on defence, and as a proportion of the total spend on national security is by far the most dominant proportion of what we spend on national security broadly defined. Secondly, I want to talk about management and decision-making structures in defence. Thirdly, four structure priorities, and I'll have to be brief on what is a large subject in that regard. And finally, I want to address what our strategic policy priorities are and what they should be, and I will have some views, including about how defence figured so poorly in this recent election campaign and why. But first, let me be somewhat quizzical about the frequency of defence ministerial turnover in this defence portfolio. In this government, this is the third defence minister in 3 years, and frankly that is not good enough. When you're trying to run an enormous organisation like defence, as I said, $27,000 million a year, 100,000 people, as some of us in this room who've held senior positions know, if ministers come and go, the machine itself thinks it knows better. And 3 ministers in 3 years is simply not good enough. And if you think that is a partisan view, let me remind you that the previous Howard government had 5 ministers in 11 years. Not a lot better, frankly. And we've lost John Faulkner and Greg Combay, who in my judgment were the best defence minister combination we've had in at least 15 or 20 years. Faulkner has retired from active ministerial position, and Combay's gone to run something called climate change. And Michael, amongst others, knows my view about climate change, but he was the most promising Minister for Defence we had, and it is, in my view, a disaster that he's gone on. I'm not being critical of Stephen Smith. I know him personally. I've worked with him in the Foreign Affairs portfolio, and I like him greatly. But it's the turnover issue and what it means for running a big bureaucracy. Okay, let's turn to money and the defence budget. Remembering that money is not a free good, although some in the Department of Defence think it is, and always have done. Treasurer Wayne Swan has said this week that the defence budget is protected, it will not be cut, and that the government is committed to the 3% real growth, and those guidelines are not in danger. Well, I've heard all that before. When I did the infamous Dibb review 20 years ago, my financial guidance was 3.8% per annum real growth, and that lasted approximately 2 years before, as Deputy Secretary, chairing the 4 Structure Committee, I had to manage 0 growth for 3 years. And we all know what 0 means, don't we? It means negative. So, you know, so far so good, but we'll see. Joe Hockey says that all government expenditure, including defence, should be reviewed for cuts. And yet the defence spokesman, Senator Johnston, wants to increase the commitment to Afghanistan, and seriously so. So we've got a slight problem of coordination there, haven't we? And politicking. You will have seen in the last couple of weeks that it has been reported in the press that the Treasury wants to see defence spending reviewed and favours overseas military purchases, off the shelf, so-called, if there is such a thing, rather than building defence equipment in Australia. Well, what a great idea that is, in terms of how we maintain through-life support and learn to modify equipment. If you build it in Australia, you know how to do it. If it's off the shelf from overseas, it can be a very difficult challenge. It's not to argue, it is not to argue that there shouldn't be some significant competition to local industry. Clearly there should. Treasury is, as I understand it, making its arguments based on this is an overheated economy, will be more so because of the 2 economy growth in, on the one hand, Western Australia and Queensland, and then the rest of us. The sort of arguments that Treasury are running is what I call the Henry Ergas flat earth approach to our national security. And some of you know Henry Ergas. he believes there's such a thing as an international competitive market for defence goods. I don't know what planet he lives on, but there is no such market. There is no such internationally competitive market for defence goods. But his line has strong support in certain senior ranks of the Defence Materiel Organisation. And actually, I'm afraid to say that in Greg Combay's recent defence industry policy that was released in this June, the line of purchasing military off-the-shelf commercial products is strong in his defence industry policy. And I've told Greg at the time that he was wrong-headed, in my view, in this regard. My view about defence industry policy is simple. We employ 29,000 people in defence industry. We're capable of building major warships, submarines, air warfare destroyers with the Aegis system on board, and we have major capabilities in systems analysis and electronic capabilities. But the previous government, under Defence Minister Robert Hill, run down our anti-submarine warfare capability, our mine-sweeping capability, and our electronic warfare capability. Not a clever thing to do. I'm not arguing for feather-bedding defence industry. I'm not arguing for subsidies and what's called Australian industry involvement. But I am arguing for our strategic priorities to be matched into our defence industry priorities. And that has got a way to go. Secondly is to management and decision-making structures in defence. Defence is top-heavy in its decision-making structures, in my view, in both the senior civilian and military ranks. Let me give you some examples. Less than 20 years ago, we had 76,000 members of the Australian Defence Force, 76,000, and we had 4 deputy secretaries, of whom I was one. Now we have only 57,000 members of the Australian Defence Force, and guess what? We have 16 deputy secretaries. Something wrong there, is there? I think so. When you look at Russell Hill, you'd think we had a really large defence force, as distinct from about half a decent crowd at an AFL Grand Final, as a former Secretary of Defence used to say. Now, an AFL Grand Final, 100,000, cut it in half, you've got 50,000, that's about what we've got. In World War II, we had 6 army divisions in World War II and about 10 major generals. Now we have 1 division and 1 reserve sort of division, and guess how many major generals? 25, each one of whom is capable of running a division. Slight problem there, we don't have 25 divisions. And I could go on with other examples. Ministers complained to me, the 2 previous ministers, that they receive about 250 ministerial submissions a week. 1,000 a month, 12,000 a year. In my time, it was 3,000 a year. The good old Robert Hill doubled it to 6,000 because he was obsessed with the detail, like most lawyers. And now it's doubled again to 12,000. How can ministers survive being inundated by that number of ministerial submissions? And as I said to John Faulkner when he first took the job, John, you've got to cut the DepSecs by at least 1/3. Each deputy secretary, in my own experience, employs about 2,000 high-grade professional staff. And if you're a deputy secretary's minister, please notice me, so I'll send you ministerial submissions. This is all true, isn't it, David? Yes, it is. And, you know, I mean, again, you'd think we were a superpower. We ain't no superpower. At best, we're a middle-ranking power with a defence force of 57,000. Something is seriously wrong, but are any of these things I'm mentioning to you getting attention? No. And we've erected this edifice, and you look at Russell Hill and the, proximate buildings, it is a big, impressive sets of buildings, and yet we have real difficulty sustaining 3,000 soldiers overseas at any one time. How can that be? And what I'm about to say will not please some of you, but my view is, not least the Australian Army needs a major independent external review. It's got too many bits and pieces of a real army. It thinks it's the US Marines, writ smaller, and the heaviness of the army in terms of our future operations, which will not be Afghanistan and will not be Iraq, needs serious revision in my view. Thirdly, 4 structure priorities. Building on my previous comment, why on earth are we acquiring two 27,000-ton amphibious assault vessels, which will be bigger than any other country in the region has, bigger than anything that Japan has, China, India, or the Russia Far East? What are we going to use them for? Well, Army will tell you they're not an assault weapon. They're going to be used, regionally. Well, where? Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, you need 27,000 tons, do you? With 1,000 troops on board and Abrams tanks and heavy artillery and helicopters? I doubt it. And one of the central problems of having two ships like that is they're very vulnerable. Imagine one being hit by a torpedo with 1,000 troops on board. Imagine the outcry. And so, therefore, to make sure that would not be the case, if and when they're deployed overseas, they'll have Collins-class submarines underneath, they'll have air warfare destroyers around them, and they'll have JSF and aerial refuelers and AEWC aircraft over the top. And guess what will be left over for offensive strike operations? Answer, not a lot. Not a lot at all. There are two other key force structure decisions coming up soon. One is the Joint Strike Fighter, and whether we buy 100, or as the white paper implies, 5 squadrons, more like 125, or whether the initial serious buy will be about 50. I'm in favour of the larger buy. I dismiss those who argue that the F-22 Raptor is something we can afford. It's a single role, air superiority aircraft. And the Super Hornet is a consideration, and there'll be others who know more about it than me, but we absolutely must maintain our leading technological edge over potential regional adversaries. And if you think that's Paul Dibb talking, it has been the policy of successive governments for at least 20 years. And in terms of air power and submarine power, that is a central, both of those things, Joint Strike Fighter and submarines, are central force structure decisions looming. The Collins decision will be later, the Collins replacement. Now, the argument is, as in the white paper, should there be 12 and larger than the Collins and equipped with Tomahawk land attack cruise missile and air-independent propulsion? Or as Aspie argues, should they be 6? Or as my colleague Hugh White argues, should there be 18? Or even 24? Well, the indicative costs, if we build them locally and from a derived Collins design and with an American combat system, the indicative figures are $36 billion for 12. So if you want 24, you're talking about $72,000 million. These figures I'm quoting to you make the broadband internet network look relatively cheap. I certainly think we do not need a small, poor endurance, short range European submarine. I have problems with conventional warhead Tomahawk and what targets it's supposed to strike, and I don't think we need a warhead, and we'll possess one that isn't conventional. The Tomahawk is very precise, but very limited with a conventional warhead as to what it can do. So money's not a free good, so if you're looking at 12 large submarines for about 36, and you're looking at 100 JSF for about, a current figure I don't have, but let's call it about 30, so we're looking at about 65 billion, just like that. Finally, strategic policy priorities. As I said at the outset, I do not favour junking last year's white paper. It has problems. Most white papers do. Most white papers are a compromise. Bureaucratically, interdepartmentally, amongst the major players, politically in terms of the dominant government. And always remember, a white paper has to be ironed out in terms of language for public consumption. It is not a classified, brutal document. It has to be careful with its language. Otherwise, every embassy in the country comes knocking on your door complaining. The 09 white paper had some really, really good stuff about the defence of Australia, the vulnerability of our north, the vulnerability of our infrastructure in the northwest, the importance of being able to dominate the sea-air gap with superior air and naval power, and our primary operational area being Eastern Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, South Pacific. It is true that the Howard government's 2000 white paper said defence of Australia was the first priority, but it did not address it in detail, And my personal view is Howard was never a great supporter of the defence of Australia. And indeed, we all know that Minister Robert Hill, we all know, don't we, he tried to get through Cabinet that the Middle East was more important than the defence of Australia. Oh, really? He failed to give John Howard his due. But there's some good stuff in the white paper. It has some contradictions. It has some... it should have been ironed out and re-edited more carefully. But this coming year is in any case the time for the Deputy Secretary Strategy in my old job, Peter Jennings, to do a classified review of our strategic priorities. And my personal view would be, I do not believe we face an imminent demise of the United States. It's going through serious problems, and it is true that, relatively speaking, China is taking advantage of American preoccupations in Afghanistan and its economic weaknesses, which I don't underrate because of the global financial crisis. But America, as others in this room know only too well, has enormous reserves of innovation and technology and inventiveness, which I have yet to see demonstrated by the People's Republic of China. I have yet to see the major military breakthroughs that China has come through with, even comparable with those that the Soviet Union had 20 and more years ago. So I think we need to take a cold bath about the rise and rise and rise of China. There's been too many of these straight line extrapolations. In the 1980s, Japan was going to be the new economic superpower. In the late 70s and through the early 80s, our American CIA friends used to tell me the Soviet Union was poised to outstrip the United States in military power. They told me that as late as 1987, one Robert Gates, the deputy of CIA. So look, just beware straight line extrapolations. China has some weaknesses. I'm not saying that the rise of China is not the great challenge of our time. In many ways it will be. But I think we need to take some cold, hard looks at some of the facts with regard to China. In addition to the analysis that I presume will take place of China's somewhat improved military capabilities since the White Paper, more importantly, in my view, we need to examine disturbing Chinese behaviour in the last year or so. China's attitudes to the South China Sea in its entirety being a core national interest, China's attitudes to not recognizing freedom of naval navigation through 200-mile exclusive economic zones, which every other country in the world, to my knowledge, acknowledges, possibly not North Korea. China's challenge to Japan on the Senkaku Islands, China's direction to the United States that it should not have naval exercises in the Yellow Sea to demonstrate to North Korea what Allied capabilities are. There are some questions that will need to be addressed, in my view, in the strategic review next year about some worrying Chinese behaviour. And I think we need to coolly reappraise where the United States is headed after Afghanistan. And Bill, I know you'll be talking about that, and you're the expert on Afghanistan. My views on Afghanistan are, and Professor Maley will tell you if he thinks they're rubbish, the United States' priorities are not nation building in Afghanistan. President Obama has said quite clearly his priorities are nation building in the United States because the economy is damaged. Point number one. Point number two, my dear old friend, Major General retired Jim Molan, talks about winning the war in Afghanistan. What the hell does winning mean in Afghanistan? Anybody understand or know? They saw three British wars in the late 1800s. They saw off the Soviet 40th Army for 9 years, with 15,000 dead, 50,000 wounded. And who believes that, we're going to win, whatever that means in Afghanistan? Then we have Jim Molan and Senator Johnston saying we want helicopters, artillery, tanks, and he wants to increase the troop commitment by nearly 25%. I'm not too sure, listening to Tony Abbott this morning, that he actually quite agrees with that. Tanks. I know some people have views about the use of tanks in Afghanistan. The Soviet 40th Army lost 147 tanks, 333 helicopters, and 430 artillery pieces in its war that it lost that it lost after 9 years in Afghanistan. In any case, Afghanistan, in my personal view, is not a central strategic priority for Australia. Southeast Asia is, Indonesia is, the South Pacific Islands are, China is, Japan is, the Korean Peninsula is. Ministers in the election and the opposition in the election both parroted the same sort of words. We're in Afghanistan to fight international terrorism. Oh, really? Clive Williams is here. He's the expert on terrorism, and he'll tell you that's not the case. That Al-Qaeda is in Waziristan, and that the Afghan Taliban don't show any particular signs of going back to their embrace of Al-Qaeda. The second statement we get from governments and opposition is, we therefore create stability. Well, there ain't a lot of stability, Bill, unless I'm wrong, with that corrupt President Karzai. And the fact that, according to General Kayani, the Pakistan Chief of Army, former head of the ISI, in the last 5 years, the Taliban have increased their presence in every single province except one or two in Afghanistan, according to him. And the third reason is the more likely one. We're in there for the US alliance. Well, we did that in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the first Gulf War, Afghanistan and Iraq. But we tend to be the ally that can't say no. The Canadians and the Kiwis were not in Iraq, and you will recall the British were not in Vietnam, but we're in all of them. One day we will be the ally who occasionally says no. And finally, as Paul Kelly correctly observes today, when we're talking about defence priorities, with a minority government propped up by the Greens and others and the Andrew Wilkies, I need to know just where the Greens' defence policy fits into this government's defence policy, because the Greens' defence policy is highly destructive of the US alliance, of defence spending, and of having a capable, modern defence force. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. We won't die looking for an opinion, and it was a very insightful and I'm sure will stimulate a significant debate. But thank you very much, it was excellent. I'd like now to introduce Professor Bill Maley, who's the Foundation Director of the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy since 2003. As Paul said, a recognised world expert on Afghanistan, but beyond that, on Middle East issues, on state building, on global governance. Bill has taught at many universities around the world, but now at the ANU for the last 8 years, and before that at ADFA and elsewhere. He brings real experience and expertise to this role this evening, and I thank him very much for the support he's given the college, and I'd now ask him to address us.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. I was reflecting as I strolled over that over 30 years ago, Paul and I were at a conference on Afghanistan and Iran that was held at University House. And it's interesting that 30 years on, Afghanistan is still very much in the news, and my guess is that that will continue to be the case, probably for the next 30 years, if only because the particular region within which it's located is one which has been so radically destabilised by events over that period that reconstituting any kind of regional order that contributes to stability is going to be quite difficult. I was in Afghanistan just last week, and I'll make a couple of comments arising from my observations of the situation there. But what I want to do is begin by making some comments about the wider Afghanistan and Pakistan environment. I then want to link that to another issue which has been very much in the news in Australia, namely the issue of border control and the extent to which that might be seen as a security challenge. And then I want to make some comments about how diplomacy and also international aid might or might not be effective in trying to address some of the problems that this particular conflict formation offers to us. Afghanistan has been in significant difficulty since shortly after the overthrow of the Taliban regime and the conclusion of the Bonn Agreement in December 2001. Effectively, this is because momentum is very important in this kind of situation, and momentum began to be lost in Afghanistan early in 2002 when the expansion beyond Kabul of the International Security Assistance Force was blocked, and more seriously when the invasion of Iraq in March 2003 fatally sucked a lot of oxygen out of a theatre of operations in which the challenges were still extremely acute, although the disposition of the Bush administration was to see them as under control. There are two laws which I'd put forward as mine, referring to transitions. One is that if it's taken 30 years to get into a mess, it's going to take about that time to get out. And that tends to create a significant and rather obvious problem, which is that the time horizons of political leaders in countries that engage in interventions are often much shorter than that, and their desire is for a quick solution in which one can get in and get out, and rarely will a complex conflict formation permit that kind of luxury. The other problem is that in this sort of environment, one really has one chance to get things right. If one begins with a range of defective settings, the difficulty is that there will then be a crystallisation of new interests around those defective arrangements that will fight tooth and nail to oppose moves that would get a transition back on course. And rarely will those parties that have intervened from the outside have much taste for taking on those kind of actors. And once, therefore, one gets on an unhappy course, it's rather difficult to get off it. It's like avoiding the iceberg if you're the captain of the Titanic. After the loss of momentum in Afghanistan, a number of other problems came along. One was the problem of dysfunctional political structures built into the 2004 constitution that created a central executive office in Afghanistan that was heavily overloaded. The president was expected to be the symbolic head of state and the executive head of government, and a one-man interagency process to resolve tensions between different ministries that had been dished out like door prizes to various political factions that had taken part in the Bonn Conference. In addition to this, there was the problem of ineffectual leadership. Ahmed Karzai is a tragic figure in some ways, that in the very early period of transition, he made inclusive comments that had a very positive resonance within Afghanistan. But of course, he'd grown up politically in a state-free environment in which politics to him meant alliance building and networking and the use of patronage rather than the development and implementation of policy. And yet, if forces that are supporting a transition are at some point to be able to hand over the process of rule to local actors, they have to have partners that are actually capable of developing and implementing policy, and that's what is spectacularly lacking in the Karzai government at the moment. The disposition to engage in networking and in patronage, of course, then tends to fuel corruption as a feature of the political environment, which in the Afghan case was severely aggravated by the flow of funds in unregulated fashion into the country, very often from donors that should have paid much more attention to capacity building and much less to throwing money at problems as a way of solving them. This has led to some hair-raising situations, such as the one which confronts us to this day, where a $360 million transport contract of the US military is actually held by the son of the defence minister of Afghanistan. And if somebody who can explain to me why that doesn't create some kind of conflict of interest, I'd be interested to hear the explanation. Added to this, of course, was the problem of the resurgence of the Taliban insurgency against the Afghan government. I don't think this was a natural development. Ordinary Afghans back in 2002 had hit rock bottom, and they were very keen to have international forces come into their country. There was no mood whatsoever to welcome the return of the Taliban. But in a country like Afghanistan, people tend, even if they don't understand constitutions, to have an acute understanding of power complexities. They're watching all the time for an indication from which direction the wind is blowing. The Iraq invasion signalled that the wind had shifted adversely, And that meant that when the Taliban reappeared very shortly afterwards, a lot of Afghans who didn't actually like them in any strongly normative sense nonetheless feared them, or feared that their particular area at some point in the future would fall under the control of the Taliban, therefore felt very reluctant to position themselves as supporters of the government. It's also the case that, contrary to what's often thought, the Taliban are probably best seen not simply as representatives of the Pashtun ethnic group, even though they're overwhelmingly Pashtun, but rather as a complex ideological movement, rather totalitarian in disposition, and I think rather difficult to accommodate within the wider framework of Afghan politics. And that's why I'm rather pessimistic about where things are likely to go if the Taliban return to any position of power or authority within the country. The prime reason that they've resurged, I think, is that they remain an instrument of the geopolitical objectives of the Pakistan military. This was certainly the case when they emerged in 1994. Essentially, they were a product of the failure of the so-called Hezb-e Islami of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar to be able to hold and occupy territory and serve Pakistan's interests, and the search began for another kind of force. And the Taliban, which had existed as loose groups of student combatants in Afghanistan since at least 1984, were then instrumentalised into a different kind of force. And the striking feature that brought this out was the way in which, instead of following the seasonal pattern of tribal conflict in Afghanistan, which is distinctively shaped by agricultural considerations and the impossibility of farming and fighting simultaneously, instead one saw very much the tactics of a trained conventional military being used with a kind of land blitzkrieg based on land cruisers and motorbikes, sending forces very quickly through different parts of the country in order to destabilise the enemy. Now, this, at one level, I think is remote from Australia, and I agree with Paul entirely that I think the reason that Australian forces have been deployed is primarily to do with our alliance relations, and certainly the notion that we have to fight them there so we don't fight them here is pretty nonsensical. On the other hand, it's not the case that we are insulated from what happens. And one of the reasons for that is that the Afghan population is a highly mobile one. It's been the case in recent times that very large numbers of Afghans, when faced with a horrible situation at home, have taken the option of exit or flight, something which is actually religiously sanctified by the flight of the Prophet Muhammad during his life, the so-called hijrah. And in fact, the word that's used for refugees in many Muslim countries is muhajirin, which is derived from the notion of the flight of the Prophet and gives it a particular sanctioned character. Out of a pre-1978 population estimated at 13.05 million, by the end of the 1990s, almost 6.2 million Afghans were living outside the country as refugees. If we saw the Taliban come back, I wouldn't be surprised to see very, very large numbers indeed coming out of Afghanistan. And since if they come out to the south and the east, Australia is the first country they would hit that's actually a party to the Refugee Convention, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw people heading in this direction as well. Now, one of the things that's actually triggering that, even at the present, I think, is the flood of loose discussion from Western political leaders about the virtues of talking to the Taliban. We see this all the time. There's a headline in today's Washington Post to that effect. We had David Miliband's speech at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology earlier this year that touched very much on these kinds of themes. And the problem, of course, is that very often leaders of this ilk don't seem to realise that there is an Afghan as well as an international audience for remarks of this sort. 70% of the Afghan population listen to international shortwave radio broadcasts on a daily basis. They are extremely well informed about what goes on in the wider world, and talk of that sort is almost calculated to set people to flight. Part of the difficulty is that talk about negotiations gives no real indication of what red lines in the sand might exist to limit what might be given away in the course of negotiation. One hears loose talk about the need to respect the Afghan constitution, but we know very well from the deferral of the date of the presidential election last year that the UN and the international community have no respect for the Afghan constitution when it comes to their convenience. So why should Afghans attach any weight to that kind of thing? It is not a wise move ever in Afghanistan to be caught out. And at the best, talk of this sort internationally disinclines people within Afghanistan from positioning themselves as supporters either of the government or international forces. At the worst, it actually can be a trigger to flight. And this, of course, is linked with very bad experiences which people have had in the past. The big trigger for movements of ethnic Hazaras out of Afghanistan in the late 1990s was the so-called Mazar-i-Sharif massacre from the 8th to the 11th of August 1998, when 2,000 people were massacred by the Taliban in Mazar in 3 days. In gruesome circumstances that were subsequently depicted by Rupert Colville of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in an article in the International Herald Tribune. In recent times, there have been some equally gruesome problems. On the day Julia Gillard became Prime Minister of Australia, 11 Hazaras in our province, Uruzgan, were found decapitated by the roadside. And the assessment of the local police was that this had happened to them because they were Shiites and because they were Hazaras. And this particular ethnic and sectarian group, of course, has experienced discrimination of a high level in Afghanistan since the late 19th century. The targets of this kind of attack are not limited, of course, to the Hazaras. And on the 6th of August, an old friend of mine, Tom Little, from the International Assistance Mission, was murdered with 10 of his colleagues in Badakhshan, where they were involved in a medical mission, actually, to bring ophthalmological services to people in remote communities. And just yesterday, I had a letter from his widow, which exchanged some of the last email messages that had come from him before he was slain. And this is in a province, Badakhshan, which until recently was thought to be largely isolated from the Taliban. But one of the things I discovered when I was in Kabul last week was that the district of Tagal within Badakhshan was completely taken over by the Taliban on polling day. And it was only a revolt by the local villagers rather than any intervention by the Afghan National Army or the Afghan National Police that drove them out. This is why I found somewhat surreal the suggestion in reported leaked cables from the Australian Embassy in Kabul that Hazaras have been experiencing a golden age. If 11 people are having their heads chopped off, doesn't seem much of a golden age to me. And it, I think, is a reminder that there are limits associated with diplomatic reporting. Afghanistan is an extraordinarily difficult environment in which diplomats operate. It is much easier to report chatter around the international agencies in Kabul than actually to go out and do serious research about what's going on in the more dangerous districts. And I don't hold that against diplomats who have futures that they want to see. But it does mean that we should be wary of attaching too much weight to those kinds of sources as opposed to the concrete evidence of bodies lying on the landscape that actually tell us more about the environment in Afghanistan. There's a broader point here. Bernard Brodie made it forcefully during the Vietnam War about Lyndon Johnson, that it can be dangerous to rely too much on cables. One of Johnson's great weaknesses, according to Brodie, was that he attached too much weight on what people like Ellsworth Bunker were telling him from the US Embassy in Saigon. And there were many other sources which were equally important. I think we'll see, as a result, a lot of people arriving by boat in Australia, but at the same time, I don't think it's a problem from a security point of view. The likelihood that people who are a security threat to the wider Australian community will be on those boats is very low. Anybody who is will likely to be thrown off to the sharks by other members of the boat long before it reaches Australian territory. And the pattern of security assessment in the past has been that, with the exception of a small number of people from Sri Lanka, virtually nobody who's arrived in that way has been found to be a security threat. And indeed, the numbers, of course, are by international standards trivial. If one thinks about football stadia, I was at the Dallas football stadium in November last year, and at the current rate of boat arrival in Australia, it would take 25 years to fill the stadium in Dallas. And I think we can live with that. There is, however, I think, one serious security problem related to arrivals from offshore, which has been highlighted in recent days, highlighted by the deaths through an American drone strike in Pakistan of German nationals. This relates to what is known as the Electronic Travel Authority, by which if people are citizens of a number of designated Western countries and hitherto have not come to the attention of security authorities, it is highly likely that they will be issued an entry visa through a computer system, and they will not actually have had to face any Australian official until they appear at the customs barrier at Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane Airport. I published a paper with the Centre for Independent Studies some years ago about this, suggesting that it was actually harder for foreign cheese and salami to get into Australia than a foreign terrorist. I think the reports in recent times that terrorist groups have been deliberately seeking out holders of Western passports to use in future operations is a reflection of their alertness to these kinds of holes that exist now in the border control systems of many Western countries. Certainly the US visa waiver system, I think, will come under greater attention, and we need to look at the ETA system very carefully. Let me conclude with a couple of observations about the suggestion that we talk to the Taliban and a couple of comments about aid. Churchill famously said, better jaw than war, but that was not the approach that he took in May 1940. In his famous debate with Viscount Halifax in the British cabinet. And I think it's worth recalling for that reason that it's not necessarily a good test of whether one should be involved in a particular conflict, whether the key leaders can identify the precise way by which one will exit from a conflict formation. If Churchill had been asked in May 1940 to detail how he would defeat Nazi Germany, he would not have been able to give a coherent account. But he did have a sense that there could be parametric shifts in the environment which could produce victory. And those, of course, came about firstly through the German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, and then with the Pearl Harbor attack on the 7th of December, which in a structural sense determined what the outcome of the war was going to be. In that sense, I think we need to be very careful also with the notion that because we don't have an ability to win in Afghanistan in a classic sense, the only route that's available to us is that of negotiating with the Taliban. I think the risks that are associated with that are very high. One obvious risk is the possibility that just as radicals claimed that the capacity of the Mujahideen to drive the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan by February 1989 proved the capacity of religion to act as a force multiplier, so again the radicals would undoubtedly claim that a perceived US defeat in Afghanistan yet again established the strength of religion as a way of confronting the force even of the strongest country in the world. And the consequences of that could be quite severe. I think in Afghanistan itself, there's also a much greater likelihood that we would see the resumption of a serious civil and regional conflict with forces such as Russia and Iran arming groups within Afghanistan in order to prevent the advance to their borders of the Taliban. And the potential then would be that this could have spillover effects into other countries, not necessarily through the direct dispatch of armed conflict, but through seismic effects on the political orientations of movements elsewhere. And one of the dangers in this situation, of course, would be in Pakistan, where the Pakistan Taliban hitherto has been limited in its capacity because of its willingness to stick to a largely religious message. If in the wake of the flood crisis it were to rebadge itself as a Robin Hood movement, defending the poor against the rich, I think it would be a far greater structural threat to the stability of the Pakistan state than we've seen up to this point. And anything that minimises the kind of inspiration that that group might receive is probably a good thing. Ultimately, I think any agreement struck with the Taliban would unravel pretty quickly because they simply don't accept norms of international comity of a sort which are important to make agreements work. And I think they would prove, any such agreement would prove a good deal less durable than the January 1973 Paris Accords on Vietnam, which of course didn't avert the fall of Saigon in April 1975. Where I think we do need to go is in terms of confronting Pakistan much more directly. The oddity of the current situation is that there's no doubt whatever that Pakistan is up to its neck in the situation in Afghanistan, and this is brought out rather clearly in Bob Woodward's new book, Obama's War, which is a very nice window into the kinds of complexities in American policy making that Paul was mentioning. And there are various ways in which pressure can be brought to bear. Positive sanctions haven't worked. I think there's something to be said for some more acute diplomatic pressures. Final comment about aid. A lot of work done by Australian forces in the field is concerned to facilitate the delivery of aid to people in Afghanistan, and that's probably a good thing in itself, but aid is not a device for winning hearts and minds in a political sense. The Afghans have been digging wells for 3,000 years. Digging more wells is not going to win them over. Hearts and minds are won in Afghanistan by the conviction that the people who are offering you assistance are going to come out on top in the long run. And it is the psychology of establishing that one will come out on top much more than just numbers of troops that is important in this kind of environment. You could halve your troop numbers, but if at the same time you manage to convince people that in the long run you are going to come out on top, then you will actually secure the popular support that would sweep the Taliban away very quickly. If the Taliban leadership in Pakistan were arrested, I suspect the insurgency would be dead within a couple of months. People have forgotten how quickly the Taliban collapsed in 2001. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that both scholarly and on-the-ground insight into a critical issue for Australian national security policy and its implications for border security. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker this evening before we get to questions and discussion, David Templeman. David currently is the CEO of the Alcohol and Other Drugs Council of Australia. Before that, for 6 years, he was the General Manager of Emergency Management Australia. And before that, held a number of senior executive positions in the Defence Department, both in Australia and overseas. David brings a different angle on national security issues this evening, and I'm delighted to welcome him. Thank you, David.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute here this evening. Firstly, I'd also like to make sure that I acknowledge the board, my board who I work for, that allow me to come and do these things out of a full-time normal running an NGO type job. What I want to do this evening is essentially outline some of the suggested priorities, particularly in the national emergency management and planning, coordination and accountability and authority space. These are issues that I have very significant concern for, and I sometimes wonder how we can somehow get them into the national security debate. Some of the comments that were made before about Michael in terms of what comprises this national security agenda and does emergency management really fit within all of that is something which I think is causing a lot of confusion nationally anyway. So, but what I would probably also do in an audience like this, and you'll see why I do this, but I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I think it's important that perhaps in situations like this, got to find this little pointer thing, but anyway, that coming. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's I'd probably sort of say, you know, how many people have got emergency management, emergency services experience? Who in this room, for instance, is a current volunteer or has been a volunteer in this space? I mean, how many of you have got a first aid qualification, a current first aid qualification? You know, so, you know, there's not too many when you look at the number of people around it. How many would know how to operate a defibrillator? Would you know where the nearest defibrillator is? So these are things that I think that you'll see why I'm banging on about some of this stuff, is that I think it's particularly, you know, very, very important. I'm not here this evening to talk about intractable matters or problems, and we don't need a conference of dangerous ideas to determine gaps or failings or remedies. The matters I want to share with you are quite prosaic, and they can be fixed by existing leadership. We don't need more investment, more technology. I mean, Paul's already alluded to this enormous mass of people that we have, say, in the federal bureaucracy, and that's not just within defence, it also exists in other federal government agencies, and it exists within states and territories. Federal government's not immune to this. There's enormous layers of people that get caught up in this particular space. But simple things need to be thought about, talked about cooperatively and cohesively, and then arranged to protect life and property. Now, I say this for reasons of threefold. I served as DGMA for 6 years, and my tenure followed a long line of people, right back to Alan Stretton in 1974, who was sent to Darwin to assist after Cyclone Tracy. And the same national planning and coordination deficit existed then, and it exists still today. And I worked on the Bali 1 and the Bali 2 tragedies, the Asian tsunami, the Canberra fires, and the frequency and the severity of the toll, and we see the more and more disasters that have happened over the last few years, and we still see this complacent mindset within the planners and within the organisations and within the community, and people feel that something will come and fix them up and save them. And we're a country of 22 million people, and it's about the same size of the City of London on any working day. And it doesn't need to be that hard. I mean, but we continually believe that some other bugger will materialise and fix everything for us. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I see this in my present NGO role, and I relate it to many aspects of health delivery. So I'm not just highlighting my experience in relation to emergency management. Very simply, it boils down to maintaining effective and trusting relationships between states and territories and the Commonwealth. And I often liken this to the oxygen cylinder problem that was encountered by the New York Fire Department in response to 9/11. The first wave of firefighters went in, and they didn't know what they were letting themselves in for, sadly. And they went in fully kitted with all available oxygen equipment. Backup cylinders were provided from another county fire department. And when the second wave was about to be deployed, not knowing what had happened to the first wave, only then was it realised that the coupling devices and the cylinders were different and were therefore useless. So we do need to work a lot better. And only last week I was in South Australia and Western Australia in discussion with a range of senior decision makers in emergency response and recovery. And the level of confusion about the statements on emergency management being made by the Commonwealth is absolutely rampant. And this was quite obvious during the recent election campaign. Government statements in a document titled A Secure and Fair Australia, which without any basis or fact says, quote, "We have pursued an all-hazards approach to national security, which includes protecting Australians from risks to their safety, whether man-made or natural events." The document goes on to criticise the previous Howard government about buck passing to the states and territories. Well, let me assure you tonight that buck passing is still very much alive and well, and I think, in my opinion, it's probably worse. However, my greatest disappointment with this document is where it indicates that we have moved, quote, "we have moved to align emergency management arrangements across Australia into a single, comprehensive and coordinated plan to ensure consistency of planning and pooling of expertise and resources." I mean, this is absolutely laughable, and it's also condescending. At the moment, the Commonwealth has really no authority in this area. So how it can actually say that they've moved to establish this plan is just absolutely crap as far as I'm concerned. During the election, I challenged Labor to show me this comprehensive plan, only to receive a whole lot of patronising mumbo-jumbo that failed to answer my concerns. I've since gone back to the attorney and asked to see this so-called plan. Of course, I haven't received a response. Within this latest election claim, there is a lot of "we will" type statements, all of which depend on strong collaboration, commitment and capable leadership. For a single, comprehensive and coordinated plan to exist would require endorsement and sign-off between all jurisdictions and the Commonwealth. And I know it doesn't exist because the states have told me so. The election statement says the Gillard government will provide national leadership to all Australian governments in the event of significant natural disasters or emergencies. I have to wonder why and how. I would urge the government to revisit Rick Smith's 2008 review on Homeland and Border Security arrangements, which was presented to the Rudd government in December 2008. the majority of which championed the concept of a National Security Advisor and new functions for government. The following recommendation, Mr Smith's review, was agreed by the Rudd government as announced on the 4th of December 2008. There will be a more streamlined approach to emergency management which would optimise efforts and address fundamental gaps such as a national plan to deal with catastrophic disasters. To my dismay, I still believe that all these folk, to quote another secretary, Tony Ayres, are still living in Fantasia land and they still believe in the tooth fairy. To my best of my understanding, no plan exists, nor do I feel that there is even the spirit of cooperation between jurisdictions and the Commonwealth to develop and agree on such a plan. Only last week, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute issued a special report on Australia's national security institutions titled Reform and Renewal, and again it contains further criticism about lack of legislative or structural changes to national security agencies in order to drive improved cohesiveness and coordination. ASPI states, the whole of government rhetoric is commendable, and it follows that national security agencies must operate in an all-hazards environment, but fails to convert these into practical outcomes. Again, a well-understood and national plan would address this. During the last 3 years, there have been many opportunities to consider what a national emergency management plan might involve. When we think of equine influenza, avian flu, major cyclones, the severe storms, including the Perth hailstorm, which a lot of people you probably wouldn't know is probably the highest cost in terms of damage, in terms of the Insurance Council of Australia, the highest cost of a natural disaster in the last 10 years. We see a parochial approach to response and recovery combined with what I would describe as a single stovepipe attitude to addressing these issues rather than a more cohesive, joined-up, integrated approach. The federal government's attitude is simply to offer limited military assistance, if available, which creates huge expectations and unrealistic perceptions on the capacity, the skill sets and the surge capability of the ADF. Now, you'll probably also appreciate, being a former Director General of EMA, that I would have had a following and a keen interest in the recent Royal Commission into the bushfire inquiry of the devastating fires of Black Saturday. And that report, their report, leaves, in my view, a lot of questions unanswered. The critical one is just how Australia would have coped, for instance, if Black Saturday had left us with not only 173 deceased, but also 1,500 critical casualties requiring urgent medical attention and hospitalisation. I also ask, what do we think the situation would have been if 173 people had died in Victoria as a result of a terrorist act in Victoria and not the fires? I'm sure we would have seen a really, truly national effort led by the federal government in response and recovery. So why can't we elevate our thinking into a genuine, all-hazards, multifaceted national approach to disaster management in this country? I believe we've got a broken situation which is blamed on actually avoided the finger being pointed on what aspects of reform and leadership need to be taken on. Responsibility has been left solely with the Victorian government for its failure, when in reality there are issues of national consequence which cannot and should not go unnoticed or be left unanswered. I feel that a huge opportunity to learn lessons and improve things has gone begging. And again, this has been borne out more recently when we've seen the worst flooding in Victoria in 15 years. The bushfire report's findings in relation to land use planning and urban town management, together with community resilience measures, governance and accountability, and volunteers, all mean so much to the future. All mean so much to the future well-being of this nation, and it's not just a task for Victoria alone. Where is the thinking federally about these matters? It's a great pity that the National Security Advisor wasn't asked to give evidence at the Bushfire Royal Commission. It might have assisted in really defining and giving and working out what the real and important purpose of the NSA is. And I say that especially if it has and all has its focus. I mean, do we all know what the NSA's responsibilities are in emergency management? Because I certainly don't. It's very confused, I think, across the whole of the federal system. The August 2009 interim bushfire report addressed some aspects of federal government assistance in emergencies. The interim report also outlined a review it outed a review finalised in 2005 on how Australia might cope with a catastrophic disaster. That report was kept under wraps by the federal government for over 3 years for so-called, quote, security reasons. One wonders, in hindsight, if there'd been a serious level of interest and engagement nationally on catastrophic disaster planning, would the response to Black Saturday have been any better, especially in relation to leadership, coordination and reaction, together with adequacy of warnings to all who were affected. A lot has been said recently about population sustainability and pressures we're experiencing with choked infrastructure, roads, transportation, hospital, medical facilities, multi-housing developments and poor land use planning. One has to ask some critical questions on where is the thinking about the need to evacuate a large population centre and how would this be achieved? How are we engaging these communities on the nature of risks that they live in and what is expected of them in a major crisis? We hear buzzwords about investing in community resilience strategies and having community doing more for itself, re-preparation and prevention measures. Things like family first aid, maintaining adequate stocks of water and food for the first 72 hours of disaster, these are rarely discussed. Lastly, we can't forget our volunteers, the backbone of emergency management nationally and all too often neglected. Let's be serious about recognising the worth and the cost they incur for undertaking this support for society. We currently give lip service to this great effort and we don't tackle the chestnuts of investing in retention, recruitment, training, incentives, portability and application of skills into other employment categories, intergenerational drivers, together with gender and demographic and cultural imperatives. Get serious about this or lose it big time. If we have to replace this thing tomorrow, it's going to cost $12 billion per annum to replace the whole volunteering effort in the emergency management space at the moment. All of us will pay heavily if the volunteer pool no longer exists. Now, I was asked to say a few words about health capability and capacity. We saw in the recent election campaign, thank God, an acknowledgement of lacking of emergency medical facilities and doctors. Let's hope this gets attention as part of the health reform agenda. We've been very lucky that we haven't actually ever had to face the big one. A catastrophic event that would produce extensive casualties such as a significant terrorist act, large-scale industrial accident, a collapse of a city skyscraper, an air disaster, a tsunami hitting a big population centre or a flood in a densely populated area. In developing a health recovery response to disaster, we face numerous constraints. Most ambulatory and hospital services are overstretched on a daily basis. Overburdened operating theatres and emergency departments, pre-hospital and paramedical capability, along with medical and nursing shortages, they all limit any surge capacity for a large influx of critically injured people. We can only have a situation just in the region here. If we had 2 buses come together here, just in this region alone, and we ended up with probably 25 major casualties, it would overwhelm the medical capability in terms of response that we have in this city alone. The number of Australian hospital staff and paramedics who've undertaken disaster training is extremely low, and we have very few people trained in high-level strategic leadership in health response to disasters, and even fewer with hands-on experience in dealing with serious incidents. We should address inadequacies in national mass casualty airlift also, rather than creating a perception that the ADF will fulfil this role. So what should we be doing now? First, Australia's counter-disaster agencies and governments at all levels need to make a greater efforts to educate community about the hazards they face and encourage community-level safety planning, and those who choose to live in bushfire or flood-prone areas must share some of the responsibility for dealing with risk. Warnings must be preceded by education about risks, and secondly, as a nation, we need to address problems in land use planning. Due to population pressures and lifestyle choices, there are increasing demands on the development of high-risk locations. Building near bush, on floodplains or on foreshores poses dangers to the community safety, but is rarely discussed because of the potential impact on land and house prices. I'll go in, Prime Minister Rudd said after the Black Saturday fires that they would rebuild these communities brick by brick and school by school, hall by hall. These messages are very misguided, and we shouldn't be encouraging development in these sorts of high fire-prone environments, and existing settlements should be removed from high-hazard fire-prone environments. We need to deal with the fragmentation of our national emergency management response effort, and like counter-terrorism, There has not been a similar degree of national attention in emergency management policy planning, investment and practice. So noting my earlier criticism of unsubstantiated election statements, the federal government should, I believe, show leadership in driving greater coordination of federal agencies in emergency response and recovery through a cabinet mandate to this effect. Federal legislation should be enacted to allow the Commonwealth to exercise necessary emergency powers should a catastrophic disaster occur, and we won't know if we are ready for a catastrophe unless we really test a national plan and resource capability regularly and learn from events. So in conclusion, I'd start with some very simple measures. Decide on who is in charge for setting the national agenda, because we don't know. Develop an agreed national emergency management plan which genuinely addresses all hazards and which is endorsed by all jurisdictions and the Commonwealth, setting out accountable standards and authority. Focus on sensible, practicable, achievable and resilience measures like family first aid, pantry lists, basic volunteering support and the like. Engage the community about risk and share information rather than implying a mentality of a need to know, which only contributes and aggravates complacency. And lastly, think big, outside the box, both in a national and a regional context, including the conduct of realistic, no-notice exercises to test our catastrophic response and recovery capability, and then act on those gaps. Thank you for your attention.
You want to sit up there for a minute for a few questions? Thank you very much, David. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions of the speakers or points that people wish to raise. Could I ask, please, given the limited time, because we really need to be out of here within 10 or 15 minutes, could I ask that the questions or the points of view be kept succinct and that the answers be similarly precise? The floor is open. I just repeat the thrust of the question for the purposes of the vodcast. It's a question about appealing to hearts and minds in Afghanistan by highlighting the inadequacies of governance.
Yes. Yes, at the moment, I think the broad swathe of opinion in Afghanistan is that the Western powers are on their way out, and that is something which is creating all sorts of hedging problems on the ground as people try to position themselves in as least as vulnerable a position as they can. But there's no doubt when you talk to ordinary people that they're acutely aware of the vulnerability. Human Rights Watch put out a searing report not all that long ago on the position that women would likely occupy should the Taliban come back to positions of influence, and that would just be the beginning of the trouble as far as ordinary Afghans are concerned.
Yes.
My question to you, Professor Dibb, is since 1972, I think it was, has anyone ever developed a second generation submarine that worked properly?
Just, Paul, for a second, the question goes to the point of the quality and effectiveness of submarine technology and manufacture.
I'm not a technical expert, but the advice I've had over many years is the answer to your question is no. That submarines are very complex, very dangerous devices. They take a lot of development, and unlike in a combat aircraft where you develop a fighter aircraft and one spears in, that's one pilot dead. If the submarine goes, you've got, a couple of hundred people. The issue of submarines for us is, and I know there are views probably in the room about the Collins. We had a good run out of the Oberons, and I was closely involved from 1978 with certain operations of the Oberons in the Cold War. But the view was, when we developed Collins, that we needed something that was a lot bigger, with a lot further range, that we needed to operate in the North Pacific, and if necessary in the far Indian Ocean, and that we needed a weapon load that would be serious, not just with torpedoes, but with harpoon. But you're right, I mean, obviously it was a big ask to develop a basically Swedish submarine that had operated in the shallow waters of the Baltic, when in fact a lot of people in defence, as I recall, it favoured the German design, and the Germans have got some bonny boats still. The issue for us will be, is there any currently commercially available conventional submarine that has the range, endurance, weapon load that strategically we're looking for out of the European stable? Or will we have to upgrade and modify a basic Collins platform? And in any case, our Navy, I think I'm right in saying, will argue strongly for an American combat system. And our experience of the Collins is the American combat system is absolutely superb. So look, I'm not arguing for us to do something quickly overnight, as some are with regard to Collins. It's going to take some time. But frankly, I have to say that this government has been dragging its feet on the Collins, and probably it's because of Kim Beazley's experience with the Collins, you know, that it made more noise than the rock orchestra. No, it didn't. At patrol quiet speed, try and find it. It had some other noise issues. So, you know, as in certain other things to do with Afghanistan, politics gets in the way of good decision making.
Thank you. In the front.
Rebecca Irwin from the Australian Federal Police. One of the things that the Rudd government did and the Gillard government is continuing is to have a single national security budget, so that ministers have to have before them proposals from all of the national security agencies. I'd be interested in the panel's views on the principles that should guide the government in putting that proposal together, and in particular any views on where things like serious and organised crime, aid spending, emergency management measure up against the more traditional foreign affairs and military and defence spending, and how a government should be guided to help make those judgment calls.
That very easy question concerns the national security community budget and an overall perspective on priorities in it. I'm not sure if anybody... Bill, do you want to say something?
Just make one observation, which is that whether one has a centralised budgeting approach like that or not, I think it's very important to recognise that different instruments will have different appropriate uses, and that, for example, one shouldn't see the dispatch of police to a particular area as a cheap and easy substitute if one doesn't want to increase a military commitment, because the role of civilian policing is very different from the role of armed militias or the role of militaries within a conflict environment. And John McFarlane and I, almost a decade ago now, did a study based on the experience of the Australian Federal Police officers who deployed in East Timor. And one of the things that came out very clearly from that particular research was that the roles are distinctive, they're not easy substitutes, and therefore there also always needs to be a consideration virtually from scratch as to whether a particular environment is appropriate for the use of a particular instrument or whether it's not. And if that kind of discussion takes place, I have no problem. But I think the danger is that political leaders looking to be seen to be doing something may be tempted to send 50 police from the International Deployment Group off in a particular mission, even if the scope for them to do all that much on the ground is limited and something else might be required.
Dave, you got a quick comment?
Yeah, just a brief comment. I think this comes back also to this definitional issue about what is in or out of national security. I mean, the last thing I need to do is have somebody talking about bombs and bullets in this whole thing. And that's where I think some of the focus has been. I mean, I liken it to the situation that we spent $10 billion in relation to counter-terrorism probably since 9/11. It's probably been more since then. And most of that money went to defence, AFP, and to the intelligence agencies. I'm not going to underscore or question that. But the amount of money that was actually spent by the national federal government in terms of dealing with consequences of a terrorist event or any event was minuscule. There's about $500 million, and most of that went really in terms of the health stockpile. Now, it's all very well to say that this is a state and territory issue, but there's got to be a lot more harmonisation and understanding around this whole thing, and it eliminates some of the problems about, issues about interconnectivity, which I raised, and equipment and all those sort of things, and also arrangements. But that discussion, that conversation, isn't really taking place. And it does require that leadership I said before, but you've got to sort those definitions out first and foremost before we start talking about one budget for national security, because I know who'll be putting their hands up first.
Paul, did you have anything?
Just very briefly, Michael. I mean, one of the problems with the definition of national security, it's an issue I presume you're tussling with, Michael, and that is it can be all-encompassing, climate change, organised crime, piracy, rise of sea levels. And I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be an overarching approach in a much more rigorous way to what is national security and what isn't. But I think we've got to be careful. I mean, Kevin Rudd's speech, the one he made on national security, which announced the creation of the National Security Advisor, in my view, was useless. It included everything, including hugging trees. I mean, that is not the way you develop policy. And of course, just very briefly, if I was back in my old job as DepSec in Defence, my concern, of course, would be, and you're smiling, in that Defence, and I'm guessing accounts for 80–90% of the national security budget, all you other lot would want to raid it. And I understand that. It's eminently raidable. And, I would be the last to argue there isn't some feather bedding in Defence, to say the least, and some inefficiencies. But if you're developing a defence force, as we are out of this white paper, looking forward to 2030, you can't suddenly chop and change. You can't suddenly decide that what you've put in place is not to be done and is to be, decimated for the sake of short-term gain. I mean, a true national security approach, masterminded by the National Security Advisor, is almost mission impossible.
I think we've got time for two more questions in the middle. Questions about role models and all hazards approaches.
I wouldn't want to say that there are, that there is. I wouldn't. The question I'd throw it back at you and say, no one ever questions and ever really criticises the response, say, to the Madrid train bombings. Now, sure, that's a country that was on a situation of basically worrying about ETA and Basque separatists and the like. But when that event happened, there were 150 people were critically injured, and there were about 100 people who were killed, and there were about 1,500 others who were injured as well. Every injured that happened between 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning, and it affected three train lines. There were 38 hospitals that were actually involved in dealing with those 150 critically injured people. There's a total integration of those hospitals. All those procedures were finished by 8:30 that night. All injured people were off scene by 10:30 in the morning. The train lines were back to running normal at 8:30 that night. So, that's just an indication of how that how that country can really, work and deliver that sort of response, and it's got that sort of, right level of response and knows what it's about. I mean, they actually rehearse the issues of a bomb going off in a tunnel, in terms of, the very things that actually might need to be undertaken. So they do realistic testing. I mean, London, for instance, when London happened...
They have to wrap it up pretty soon.
Sorry. London occurred. Those people responding to London thought that they were going to another drill because, I mean, we got to a stage in London, there was a case of when it was going to happen, and the things worked very effectively. So they're good examples that you can use, but, there are plenty of other big failures that have occurred, like Katrina and the like.
One last question, if anyone has one, or if we're all done and want to go. Oh.
movement would collapse quickly.
The question relates to the arrest of the Taliban and the potential collapse of the movement.
Yes, the research that's been done by specialists on the Taliban lately, people like Thomas Ortig from the Afghanistan Analyst Network, Professor Abdul Qadir Sinha from Indiana University, and other people who've looked very carefully at what's going on and who have interviewed people from the Taliban, point to the degree of vertical hierarchical integration within the Taliban movement. It's been described as a network of networks, but the Quetta Shura sits at the heart of the operations. Now, that is not to say that every element of the operation of the insurgents would immediately be disrupted. The greater problem that they would face is that the decapitation of the leadership would actually send a political signal to which other kind of political forces would then respond. And it's generating that kind of response to which the Taliban are actually very vulnerable on the ground within Afghanistan that really should be the focus of policy. But that's not anything like what we're seeing at the moment. Now, I'm certainly not predicting that this is going to happen because it would require a significant shift in the approach of Western governments. But Woodward's book, I think, is a useful reminder that there is one scenario which could easily produce that, which would be a successful attack in the United States of the sort that the Times Square bomber was attempting. It's quite clear from the material that Woodward presents that from the point of view of the United States, all bets would be off. There would be to Pakistan a démarche of the sort that Richard Armitage presented in late 2001 to General Musharraf, but with the difference that this time there would also be a term about long-term probation, which was fatally missing from the 2001 démarche. And it would be exceedingly dangerous under those kind of circumstances for Pakistan to resist the pressure from the United States to wind up that network completely.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Can I just, on behalf of you all, thank Bill and David and Paul very much for the candour, forthrightness of their views this evening, and for the many debates they've opened up, if not resolved. But on behalf of all of you, thank you very much, presenters, for your contribution this evening.